कि वो कंट्रीज खुद सपोर्ट करते हैं टेररिज्म को, लेकिन पूरे वर्ल्ड को ये दिखाते हैं कि हम टेररिज्म से फाइट कर रहे हैं, हम विक्टिम हैं और हम फाइटर भी हैं। लेकिन वही एक्चुअली कंट्रीज हैं जो खुद Hello, students, and welcome to another lecture. And today we shall be discussing about a global definition of terrorism or universal definition of terrorism. Post Second World War, there has been numerous attempts made by international organizations and different countries to define terrorism, which is a global challenge. This is not just limited to one country, one region, or one particular set of community, sect, or religion, but rather it's a global challenge because it covers any violent acts which are truly uncalled for in a civilized community. Terrorism is something which is not defined. The United Nations organization was established in 1945 post Second World War in order to maintain peace and harmony across the world. And after having some bitter experience from the failures of League of Nations, which was established in 1920 after the First World War, United Nations was established with some better facilities and better expertise. But still, since 1945 till today, this great international institution has failed to define terrorism. But an attempt was made in 1996 by India to define terrorism or to give terrorism a universal definition, and that was through a document called Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, CCIT, Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. But when this was tabled in 1996, it was hotly debated, and when in 2016 it was again pitched for its for being passed in the General Assembly of the United Nations, many countries, including the United States and its allies, the Latin American countries, and the Organization of Islamic Countries, they all opposed this definition given by India. The question was that why did the United States, a country that itself started a war on terror and was the most vociferous in dealing with this challenge, in dealing with this challenge, was not ready, was not willing to accept the definition given by India. So let us have a look at International Convention on Terrorism. There are certain questions that needs to be. In a lecture before this one, we discussed that how United States of America started war on terror after the 9/11 attacks on World Trade Center in United States of America. Then President George W. Bush, he started a campaign called War on Terror. That means he wanted to eliminate all the terrorist organizations, not only physically or militarily, but also he wanted to block all the finances that were being made or that were being supplied to these terrorist organizations. He also wanted to have a cultural and ideological and political fight against these terrorist organizations because he wanted to start an ideological fight to vanquish completely this ideology of terrorism. But the question was that when a global or universal definition was kept by India before the United Nations General Assembly, why did then the United States opposed it? Because United States, United States wants to show to this entire world, to the entire world, that it is the biggest keeper of democracy, it is the biggest keeper of human rights, and it is the only country in the world that is the flag bearer against terrorism. But in reality, the soldiers of the United States Army, they commit violent acts in other countries, they commit violent acts on civilians, They commit war crimes, they commit genocide, they commit crimes against humanity, and because of that, their activities, the activities of the US soldiers, they squarely fitted into the definition given by India in CCIT. And that was the reason that United States was not willing to accept this definition, and hence this CCIT could not be passed. But let us have a look at International Convention on International Terrorism. The date 26/11 has gone down in the history as a day that saw the most heinous attack carried on the Indian soil. So 26th November, it is the date that we sadly remember in the annals of Indian history, because it was the day when India saw a heinous terrorist attack on the Hotel Taj in Mumbai. And that was the day when India was reminded again to make a pitch for dealing with the issue of global terrorism and reminding the United Nations of its job to pass the Convention on International Terrorism. So the attack claimed 164 lives, left over 300 injured, and sent shock waves around the world. Terrorism has reared its ugly head every now and then and has devastated the world like nothing else. It is an issue which has affected millions of lives from Asia to the America, but till date there is no consensus on an international convention of terrorism. This is ironical. This is दिस इज अ वेरी बिग आयरनी कि जो कंट्रीज टेररिज्म को एलिमिनेट करना चाहते हैं, वही कंट्रीज जब टेररिज्म की डेफिनेशन को टेबल किया जाता है तो उसको अपोज करते हैं। इसका मतलब क्या है? इसका मतलब तो सीधा सीधा सिर्फ यही है कि वो कंट्रीज खुद सपोर्ट करते हैं टेररिज्म को, लेकिन पूरे वर्ल्ड को ये दिखाते हैं कि हम टेररिज्म से फाइट कर रहे हैं, हम विक्टिम हैं और हम फाइटर भी हैं। लेकिन वही एक्चुअली कंट्रीज हैं जो खुद टेररिज्म को स्पॉन्सर करते हैं, उनकी खुद की आर्मीज जाके टेररिस्ट एक्टिविटीज बाकी कंट्रीज में करती हैं। There is no consensus on International Convention of Terrorism. Several efforts have been made to address the problem, but negotiations have not borne out results to address the issue. Origin and status of Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. So New Delhi has pushed for an intergovernmental convention to enhance prosecution and extradition of terrorists since 1996. So since 1996, India has been trying hard to get this comprehensive convention on international terrorism passed by the United Nations General Assembly, so that United Nations comes up with a concrete definition of terrorism, and it is easy for the countries around the globe and especially the member countries of the United Nations to deal with the issues of terrorism, and to also have certain concrete parameters of defining certain person or an organization as a terrorist person or a terrorist organization. So right now, it's everything is rhetorical, everything is in the air, nothing is on the table, nothing is concrete in the hands of the countries who are dealing with this issue. Absolutely rhetorical and absolutely in the air. These countries, they are just making demagogical speeches, and they do not involve themselves in actually dealing with this issue of global terrorism. So in 2018, even after 2 decades, there is still a lack of consensus. So point of information is that India pitched this comprehensive convention on international terrorism before the United Nations General Assembly in 1996. Although consensus alludes towards the adoption of the Terrorism Convention, discussions have yielded 3 separate protocols that aim to tackle terrorism. International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, adopted on 15th December 1997. So actually, it yielded into 3 parts, but it was not comprehensively, although it was not comprehensively adopted, but the discussions have yielded 3 separate protocols that aim to tackle terrorism. One was the International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings. This is one convention, International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, which was adopted on 15th December 1997. So this convention hails from the year 1997. International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism. So one is on the bombings of terrorist bombings, International Conventions for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings 1997. Then comes the International Convention for the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism. Whosoever supplies money to these terrorist organizations, who supplies? This is the conspiracy theory. This is a conspiracy theory completely. This is, no one knows. No one knows in this world that where these terrorist organizations like Al Qaeda, Taliban, Jaish e Mohammed, they are getting money from. Nobody knows. It's it's something, uh, illusion. It is an illusion for many of us. We don't actually know. However, there are documents, there are reports where it is reported that United States supplies weapons to them. The United States does supply money and finance these terrorist organizations in order to create an Islamophobic environment across the globe. So, International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism, adopted on 9th December 1999. International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. So, one is on the suppression of terrorist bombings, 1997. The other was the suppression of financing of terrorism, 1999. And then the third protocol was International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. International Convention for the Suppression of the Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. Nuclear terrorism is something very dangerous. This was adopted in 2005. So we have three protocols. One was the International Convention on the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, 1997. The other was International Convention on the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism, 1999. And the third was International Convention on the Suppression of the Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. Nuclear terrorism is something which is also sponsored by United States, because it was the first country in the world to have initiated a nuclear group of countries, like Nuclear Suppliers Group, NSG. And it was created out of a treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the we shall be discussing it about Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty separately in another video, where I'll be telling you that how the United States very shrewdly, very cunningly had created a group of nuclear countries and decided amongst themselves that they are not going to supply any nuclear weapon to any non-nuclear country. That means they wanted to create their nuclear hegemony across the globe. So, International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, adopted on 13th April 2005. Now, why the lack of consensus? What are the reasons why there has been no consensus so far? The Sixth Committee, the primary forum for the consideration of legal questions in the General Assembly, had created an ad hoc group which is still debating the draft for CCIT. And there are several issues, but the most important of them is defining the terms related to terrorism. Multiple groups have contentious claims over what should and what should not be regarded as terrorism. What should be regarded and what should not be regarded. That's a very clear point right here. Because terrorism is something, if any organization, any person is creating a violent act, that amounts to terrorism. That's it. That's a layman's understanding of terrorism, and that should be like, it should not be limited to the layman's language, but it should be converted into a legal language, that any violent act that amounts to a sense of fear, and that amounts to killings of the people and injury to the people, that amounts to the acts of that completely amounts to terrorism. But the question is that if somebody is involved in self-defense, somebody is involved in determination of their rights, then that should not amount to terrorism. Okay. For instance, Organization of Islamic Countries has denied inclusion of liberation movement activities as terrorism, keeping in mind the Israel-Palestine conflict. Exactly. The OIC says, the Organization of Islamic Countries says that, for example, Hamas is a group. Hamas is a group of Palestinian Arabs that is fighting for its own rights. It was never created for terror activities. It was created against the genocidal activities, against the war crimes, against the brutal oppression of the Israeli army upon the Palestinian civilians. So if somebody, and nobody came to their rescue. So if somebody like Hamas is defending its rights, then if you're defending your land, if you're defending your person, if you're defending your dignity, your respect, then that should not amount to terrorism. And that's a very genuine objection to it. That Organization of Islamic Countries, they said that if there are certain liberation movements, they want liberation, they want freedom, they are fighting for it, then it should not amount to terrorism. On the other hand, the US and the allied countries, who are involved in many counter-terrorism activities, in various countries wanted the draft to exclude acts committed by military forces of states during peacetime. So that's where lies the black hole. You know, United States wanted that all the military activities which are committed during peace times in other countries by the US soldiers should be excluded from the terrorism, because so that they get impunity from committing any terrorist activities whatever they like. That means the US soldiers are involved in terrorist activities in other countries like Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and Syria. That's a very clear point. So, because it wanted the draft to exclude acts committed by military forces of states during peacetime, the Latin American countries want exactly the opposite. Hence, for the committee, prescribing an overarching definition that satisfies all the parties is a bone of contention. So, the committee prescribing an overarching definition that satisfies all the parties is a bone of contention, that because there is no consensus. India stands in a position where it is not able to understand how liberation movements should be excluded from the definition of terrorism, and at the same time it is also not able to understand, not in a position to understand that why the military activities of US soldiers in other countries during peacetime should be excluded from the definition of terrorism. Geopolitics and the act of terror. Geopolitics is one of the most important determinants that has played the invisible hand in protecting the agents of terror. Masood Azhar is a case in point, because China has been reluctant in declaring Azhar a terrorist. China has its own interest in the region. So that is why the China does not want him to declare as a terrorist. China, being a veto-wielding permanent member of the UN Security Council, there are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, we all know that. So China is one of them and has repeatedly blocked India's move to do so. So the US, Britain and France all back India to designate Masood Azhar a terrorist under the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee of the UN Security Council. So UN Security Council had a separate committee called Al-Qaeda Sanction Committee, and that sanction committee was ready to declare Masood Azhar as a terrorist, but China was reluctant to declare him as a terrorist. China in its statement said that since Pakistan did not agree with India on this issue, there is no consensus between the two directly affected parties. Beijing made it clear that China will support the issue only if Pakistan agrees with India. So China and Pakistan, they are in a very close relationship. They are in a very close friendship with each other, because they are building CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and they share common economic interests. So, that is why whatever Pakistan says has to be followed by China blindly. Pakistan government has been proven toothless when it comes to curbing nefarious activities emanating from her soil. There are scores of terrorist scams along the border, aided and funded either by the army, clandestinely, or terrorist groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed. The motive of the Pakistani administration has always been to support the fringe elements tacitly in order to fulfill its policy to bleed India with thousands cuts. So that's what India's stand is, that in Pakistan's policy has been to cut India, bleed India with 1,000 cuts. So and that is through the fringe elements that are emanating, that are growing on the soil of the Pakistan. Adoption of the convention would not only force Pakistan to withdraw any tacit state support to the terrorist groups, but would also enable India to extradite culprits who are responsible for designing terrorist acts from foreign soil. Now, comprehensive convention on international terrorism will provide legal framework which will make it binding on all signatories to deny funds and safe havens to terrorist groups. This is going to block all the safe havens and all the supply of funds to the terrorist groups. The original draft was tabled in 1996, and it included major objectives: to have a universal definition of terrorism that all 193 members of the UNGA will adopt, to ban all terror groups and shut down terror camps, deny safe haven to those who finance, plan, support, or commit terrorist act, to prosecute all terrorists under a special law, exchange information in accordance with international and domestic law, and cooperate on administrative and judicial matters to prevent the commission of terrorist act, to make cross-border terrorism an extraditable offense worldwide. Now, measures. What are the measures taken to tackle terrorism? India should play a proactive role to neutralize any threat of terrorism. Addressing UN high-level conference on heads of counter-terrorism, Indian Special Secretary extended a 5-point formula: exchange of timely and actionable intelligence, prevention of misuse of modern communication through collaboration with the private sector, building capacities for improved border controls, sharing of info related to the movements of passengers, designation of counter-terror focal points to fight global terror. So that's how, obviously, that's how you are going to deal with terrorism. That's a good start by India. But the question is that if the countries are not willing, the major countries are not willing, then how can we reach a consensus? So that's something that we need to see in the future. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.